A lot of the animating energy in American soccer is imposter syndrome and feeling like we won't have arrived as a footballing country until we're doing things the way they do it in the cool soccer countries.
Hello and welcome to the 15-Minute Book Club. This is the short form podcast where one author gets exactly 15 minutes, well, sort of, to tell you exactly why you need a copy of their new book on your shelves. As ever, we have 15 minutes more for our Patreon people as well. So those lovely people get 15 minutes where we do a deep dive into how the book was written and kind of chat around the wider themes as well. Matt, you're excited about this one, aren't you?
I am. We are recording this on day 2 of the World Cup, and I'm in the right colours because my boy Raul got his first World Cup goal last night, so I'm happy. But we've got an interesting guest who's written a very interesting book, which is rather applicable to this World Cup. So, hello, Mr. Author. Who are you, and what have you done?
Hi, I'm Leander Sharlockens. I am the author of Mandatory Book Hold-Up Moment, The Long Game, U.S. Men's Soccer and Its Savage 4-Decade Journey to the Top, or Thereabouts, with a subtitle so long that I still feel inclined to look over and make sure I'm getting it right, even though I've been doing interviews for this book for a month straight now. But it goes on a bit, as indeed the history of American men's soccer goes on. It is fitting that we're talking today because later tonight, at least here local time, the U.S. plays its first World Cup game against Paraguay, plays its first home World Cup game since 1994. And in a lot of ways, that feels like the culmination of a 4-decade project, which is what the book is really about, to lift American men's soccer. And I'm very careful to make that distinction because on the women's side, the U.S. has been dominant for a very long time, since the late 80s, really. And so it's sort of a fun little quirk that the men's and women's teams are on complete opposite trajectories, where the women started out dominating and the world is now catching up, whereas the U.S. men are very much trying to close the gap with the rest of the world. But they are trying to kind of complete their journey out of irrelevance, which is really where they were for most of the second half of the 20th century. And that was quite a complicated endeavor, which is really what the book sort of picks apart.
Which is an interesting, we'll start the timer in a minute, but an interesting sort of dichotomy, because here we have the turgid, it's going to come home. And you're like, I'm sorry, it's come home twice with 2 fantastic women's teams winning 2 Euros. And same in the States, was it 4 World Cups and 2 Olympics with the women's team? So,
yes.
Yeah, it's a remarkable record. And it's funny that we still gravitate towards the chaps when we talk.
Well, what sort of happened is that the women's national team's dominance was sort of legislated into existence by the passage of a law called Title IX, which mandated that any educational environment, going all the way from kindergarten up to college, university, spend the same amounts proportionally on men as it did on women, and fully against the understanding of even the people who wrote the law. That meant that just millions and millions and millions of dollars started flooding into women's college soccer because they had to make up for all the money they were spending on American football on the men's side. And since there is no American football for women, it went into different sports, and soccer was the big beneficiary thereof. And so, starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you get this massive pipeline of talent and all this investment in women's soccer that no other country in the world at the time was doing, while on the men's side, the sport was basically invisible and unloved. So it's a funny little quirk of legislation that nobody had foreseen.
Right. Well, that does seem more interesting. But we need to talk about the men. So let's get this thing going. I have a timer here, and this is 15-ish minutes, because if we get chatting, I'll forget to look. And right. So, Leander, your 15 minutes begins now.
Okay.
So I think, as ever, the first question we always ask everybody is, what's the pitch for this one? And I think that massively long subtitle of yours, I think sets the stall up for the international reader straight away, because straight away you know this isn't going to be hagiography, don't you?
It is very much not. No, I mean, the story of the men's national team is bizarre and weird and embarrassing in a lot of ways. And, it's sort of interspersed the history of the national team with a series of profiles. Actually, I believe all 6 of the players I profiled have some kind of Premier League connection. So that's for your UK listeners. This was an unserious team for a long time. It was an unserious program. After the US beats England in 1950 at the World Cup, with a goal scored by a player who was a Haitian dishwasher from Harlem in New York City, whose family, a very prominent Port-au-Prince family, was under the impression that he was studying accounting at Columbia University, when in fact he was playing soccer and washing dishes and chasing women, gets added to the team at the 11th hour, scores the goal that fells England, briefly plays in France, and then returns to Haiti, where he is murdered almost certainly by Papa Doc Duvalier, because he comes from this prominent family, and Joe Gaetjens, this player, was the only member of that family that the dictator could get his hands on. What gets forgotten to be mentioned is that before and after that win over England, with a series of part-timers, the US had pretty bad losses to Chile and Spain, but whatever, not important. And then they don't return to the World Cup until 1990. And in that period of time, they just sink to extraordinary depths. Between the 50s and the 60s, they go 11 years without winning a game. They barely play at all. They show up to World Cup qualifiers, sometimes without uniforms, often without a coach, sometimes without balls to practice with. They don't get any time to train. They come together the day before the game, if they're lucky, sometimes the day of the game. There was one qualifying cycle for the 1974 World Cup where they turn up to a qualifier without enough players. They only had 10 guys, and they had to pull a man from the stands just to make up the numbers, right? So that's the kind of circus that we're talking about here. And then one of my favorite chapters is in the early 1980s. U.S. soccer is so broke that the team is basically playing one game a year, if they're playing at all. And so they decide that, you know what, this is how we're going to fix this. We're going to enter the national team into the old North American Soccer League, which by then was on its last legs. Pelé was long gone. Cruyff was long gone. Beckenbauer, George Best, all these sort of superstars had played there. But by 1983, the league was hemorrhaging money. Teams were folding all the time. So the federation and the league come up with this plan that they're going to enter the national team into this league as Team America. And that way the team will get lots of practice, and that they'll finally make it to the World Cup in 1986. Spoiler, they didn't. And so the first problem was that lots of the national team players, such as they were, had no interest in this project at all. They didn't want to go play for Team America in Washington, D.C. They were on the New York Cosmos or the Seattle Sounders, and they were like, we're happy here. We don't need to do this. And so the national team winds up, or Team America winds up being this kind of band of players who had just gotten their green cards a few months earlier, which meant that they weren't even actually fully eligible for the national team. They recruit this guy called Alkis Panagoulias, who's sort of a Greek-American and who's just had all this success in Greece with Olympiacos. But it turns out he doesn't do any actual coaching. He just spends all his time chain smoking and berating his players for not crying after they lose. And so Team America comes dead last in the NASL. They score the fewest goals, and they still didn't qualify for the World Cup. They fold after 1 year, and the whole thing is just a hilarious disaster. But it sets them back on a course of at least trying things. And there's lots more weird experiments that mostly don't work out. But it kind of is the spark, and that's where I start the modern history of the U.S. team. And by 1990, they're back at the World Cup and sort of slowly progressing since then.
How about now? There we go. We'll tack a few seconds on to the end. I've got too many buttons to push here. The thing that's interesting is soccer, we'll say, because we're talking about America here, has always had a very large participation base in the United States. So why has the US Federation struggled to build this sort of groundswell that's only recently starting to come through? I'm going to ask a question about the pay-to-play model later on as well.
Okay.
But there's this baseline that they should be able to draw from. Why has it taken them so long to get to a position where they are now?
So very first thing, quick side quest. We call it soccer because the British told us to call it that. And then
Just
themselves
messing with you.
and then stopped using that word and look down on whoever does, but that's side business. When soccer kind of reemerged in the sort of 80s and 90s, it was in large part because the upper middle class, because the yuppies saw it as a safe sport for Johnny and Susie to play as little kids. They'd run around, they'd get some fresh air, they'd get nice and tired, and they wouldn't get hurt. And then
traumatic brain injuries that you see from like American football.
Yeah. And so, then when they get a little bit older, we'll put them in the real sports, right? And so soccer kind of became almost a rite of passage of American childhood, like sleepovers and the Boy Scouts and what have you. And so you had this massive participation base, but you'd lose all that participation by like age 13, 14, 15. And then it's also one of the reasons why the sport remains very much sort of a progressive Democrat-coded sport, because that's who historically has gravitated towards the game, because that's the demographic where it was typically introduced at a young age. But so the dropout rates after those ages were always enormous, and that's starting to change now. But that's how you had this discrepancy between having huge amounts of youth players and not very many good players at sort of the senior professional level.
Geography plays its part as well, doesn't it? I think you make the case for that.
Yeah, in 1994, U.S. Soccer gave Rinus Michels, the famous Dutch coach who invented total football with Johan Cruyff, they gave him some money and told him to go travel the country with his wife and said, just go watch soccer, go all up and down the country, and go talk to everybody, go see what you find out and write a report. And he came back and he said, here's your issue. You're not a country, you're a continent, which is, prophetic in lots of different ways. And he said, the soccer in Miami looks nothing like the soccer in Maine, and the soccer in Washington State doesn't look like the soccer you play in Los Angeles. And so I think there's something to that. And I think it's why you see that most of the really populous countries in the world that you would expect to be better at a sport like soccer, like China or India, actually aren't, because it helps to be a kind of mid-sized to even like below average sized country, because that way, if you have sufficient soccer culture and know-how, you can organize and you can create national structures to funnel your talent through, and you have enough of a what do you call it? You have enough of a footprint to be able to actually like absorb all of that talent and to be able to manage it all.
How is playing in Europe affected the USMNT? Because Fulham fan, we have the sort of joke that we call ourselves Full America for the amount of American players we've had come through. One of our former players is there at the moment, in Tim Ream and Jedi. How has the European experience fed into and also created conflict within the men's team? Because you think about in the 90s when the European players came back, guys were on central contracts. All the fun and games at the beginning of the league in the US as well. How's that affected progression?
So playing in Europe used to pretty much be the only game in town, because Mexican teams just, I think on principle and on culture, were never in a million years going to take on American players, or at least white American players. And so for, the 80s, the 90s, and even really until possibly 10, 15 years ago when MLS started being a little bit better funded, the objective for every player was to get to Europe as soon as possible, because that's where you could make decent money and have a decent career. And there was also just kind of a lot of the animating energy in American soccer is imposter syndrome and feeling like we won't have arrived as a footballing country until we're doing things the way they do it in the cool soccer countries. And so that's a big part of it too, is that, these players have grown up watching Manchester United or whoever, and so they want to be in that environment. But it always created interesting dynamics on the national team where you'd have the domestically based players. Once it got to a point where you could do that decently without having to basically be like a footballing freelancer playing for one team for $200 one day and then, playing for some different team the next weekend for a few $100s more, where they had to manage that. So the 1994 team had 5 or 6 players who were in Europe, fully professional, who were added to the team basically in the last few weeks. And the rest of them were on permanent contracts with the U.S. Soccer Federation because it was the only way for them to be full-time players because there just wasn't a market for their services. And then the coach they had at the time, Bora Milutinovic, who was one of the just fantastically eccentric coaches the U.S. has had. And that's one of the joys of writing this book, is discovering just how many stone-cold weirdos have been in charge of this team, including Pochettino, by the way, our present manager. And just so he sort of played them off against each other as well. So that's always been a point of contention. And it's a fairly recent thing that a player, Clint Dempsey came home from Tottenham Hotspur to go play for the Seattle Sounders because they were going to pay him a lot more money, right? And that's only recently started to happen, where it's a viable alternative to stay home and play here as opposed to going to Europe. So it's always been kind of a promised land, but it's also kind of been a wedge issue within the team as well.
In terms of, in the Patreon thing, no doubt we're going to get way more into who you interviewed for this book. But as a fan, who were you most starstruck talking to?
Starstruck. I've covered this team for so long. I don't get that bothered about these guys anymore. Also because the current generation of players, they're quite media shy. They're not intimidating. They're not really threatening in any sort of way. I'm 42 now, right? I'm not afraid of talking to 26-year-olds anymore. Probably the one I appreciated talking to the most was Freddie Adu, of Freddie Adu fame, just because he doesn't really talk anymore. So that was a good one to pin him down and to get him to tell his story, because I think anyone who will listen to an episode about a soccer book more or less knows the story of this prodigy who went professional in MLS at 14 and was, for all intents and purposes, kind of cooked by the time he was 22. He's a personal coach now, and he has regrets, and he was very open about them. And I was really glad to get those in the book.
Yeah, football manager wonder kid that you always tried to sign back in the day. And it was a terrible how it worked out for them. Right, we've got probably time for one quick one. The little profiles that you've included, how did you select those? Because you don't have the whole team in there. Of course, you've got Anthony Robinson, which you have to do because it would be wrong not to include a Fulham player. How did you select them?
With immense trepidation, because I had to sort of decide on who my 6-7 players I wasn't quite sure were going to be in like late 2021, early 2022, knowing that the book wasn't going to come out until the spring of 2026. So I spent a lot of time extremely nervous as they went through injuries, as they went through playing time problems, as Matt Turner, who's one of the characters in the book, because he's just got an amazing backstory, went to 3 different Premier League teams and flamed out at all of them. So I basically picked guys who were going to say something about the larger story of American soccer, about accessibility and about identity and assimilation and the long search for a superstar, and on the men's side again. And then when a potential one finally comes along in Christian Pulisic, finding that he actually has no interest in that job whatsoever because he just wants to play soccer and be left alone. So I wanted to be strategic about who I picked. I wrote about Ricardo Pepi, who's from the Borderlands. Is that the bell?
That's it is. Yeah.
We'll come back to Ricardo as he's again linked to Fulham, but there we go. So time for our silly question from the internet. This week, who do we have, Alex?
Okay, so there are no really bad reviews of your book, you'll be pleased to know, but there is this guy clearly doesn't do constructive criticism because his entire review of your book is, I paid $30 for Berhalter propaganda. So would you like to swat him down? Because I think that's a little unjust.
It does feel unjust. When I talk about imposter syndrome, that tends to redound to the American opinion of our national team managers as well. There's always this sense of we just keep careening back and forth between thinking what we need is the most famous manager we can find, someone who's from abroad, who grew up with the game, who is steeped in the game all his life. Let's go and get that guy. So we hire Alkis Panagoulias, the Greek I mentioned, and Bora Milutinovic, and Jurgen Klinsmann, and now Mauricio Pochettino. And inevitably, when that ends, whether in tears or not, the instinct is, you know what we really need? We need an American, someone who understands the American game and the American id and the American player, because it's so complicated and so complex here. And so what you also see is that we've had some extremely competent American coaches. Bob Bradley and
Time's up.
Keep going. This is just so it goes in. My mic wasn't working, so I have no idea how long this is.
I'm claiming my time.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
So Greg Berhalter is a terrifically competent coach, but because he's an American, because he came from MLS, because his brother was an executive within U.S. Soccer when Greg was appointed, there was just this inexplicable hatred and just lack of trust in him. So I wrote what I found and what I heard, which is that he was relentlessly well prepared and thoughtful as a coach, and that he actually did quite a good job taking a team of teenagers initially, getting them to the World Cup in Qatar, and doing fairly well there. And this does not land well with everyone.
Standing.
Very well put. Yeah.
Just before we finish, for all of our listeners, before we get to our Patreon section, how far do you think they're going to go this time?
Round of 16, I think, has to be the minimum. I think quarterfinal is feasible if they win their group and avoid Argentina in the round of 16. Because if they don't win their group, there's every chance of running into one of the big boys, and then the party's over.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was thinking quarterfinals probably a good shout. We'll tack this in as well because it has to be mentioned. What are you making of the hype cycle? Because it's being sort of memed on hard over here with the talking heads talking up the team. Having just literally written the book on the team, what do you think about the hype cycle?
I think it's sort of a necessity in the attention economy in America that, you just kind of have to exaggerate and get a little bit hyperbolic just to get anyone to pay attention, because the NBA finals are going on right now. The NHL finals are going on, the Stanley Cup. We're in the middle of baseball season. Like, there is so much going on always. We have a president who takes up quite a bit of oxygen in the room, right? And so it's also very Fox, which is the broadcaster for this World Cup, which tends to be the big, loud broadcaster. So it's all very much expected if you've been in that environment for a long time. But I can absolutely see how, as an outsider, it all looks a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, we never overhype our chances here in England.
Famously,
with a massive dose of irony. This has been brilliant. Tell everyone again what the book is called.
The book is The Long Game, U.S. Men's Soccer and its Savage 4-Decade Journey to the Top or Thereabouts.
Right. If you're one of our fabulous Patreon people, we're going to chat to the end a little bit more. I've got a question about the interesting pay model that youth soccer is going through in the States, which is a whole thing in itself, which feeds into this. But of course, join us. Hit the links in the description below. We'll put links to Leander's book there as well for bookshop.org, where you can buy his book, make sure he gets paid, and we make sure that as few billionaires get anywhere near this as possible. So until next time, everybody, thank you so much for your time. And if you're one of our Patreon people, we'll see you in a minute. Bye-bye.